From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. This is a program about regenerative agriculture and the many different paths people are taking to fix a broken food system, restore soil, and mitigate climate change. But today's show is actually a little different. We're going to be talking with one of my favorite authors about the North American continent and the animals and people who've been inhabiting it for tens of thousands of years. That's right after this announcement. As this year ends, we want to give our thanks to the Lydia B. Stokes Foundation. Since 2001, they have supported the Quivira Coalition in its work of centering dialogue between agriculture and conservation to help bring health to soil, water, and people, and to educate ranchers, farmers, students, and environmentalists. The Stokes Foundation have told us that they are profoundly grateful for the work that Quivira has accomplished and look forward to their continued impact across the Western landscape. And in turn, we're so grateful to them and their ongoing support. And if you, wonderful listener, would also like to be part of that work, we would so welcome your help. The work that land stewards are doing is not easy, but doing it together yields richer results than if we do it alone. If you find yourself in a position to give before the end of 2022, please consider making a financial contribution to Quivira. Please go to quiviracoalition.org/donate, and Quivira is spelled Quivira, quiviracoalition.org. We're talking today to author Dan Flores. Born and raised in Louisiana to a family that's been on the land for 3 centuries, he found his life's work in the American West. He's Professor Emeritus of Western History at the University of Montana, and he's author of 11 books, the latest of which we'll be talking about today. It's called Wild New World, The Epic Story of Animals and People in America. This is not directly about regenerative agriculture, which is normally the focus of this podcast, but I think it's such an important book to read and think about in the context of the land we live on, the lands we farm and ranch, the lands we conserve, and what those lands were like and who lived on them before us. As Americans, we have a tendency to forget our history, and we kind of fail to grapple with the harm we've done to other creatures and other societies. And also just how very much things change. This book paints a vivid picture of all of that, how very different the North American continent was 10, 20, and 30,000 years ago. And for me, the book was also kind of a bit of a myth buster. Scientists talk about the geological era that we're living in as the Anthropocene. That means the time when human beings have literally changed the earth. And many of us tend to think about this in the context of the Industrial Revolution. But Flores puts the beginnings of the Anthropocene back tens of thousands of years when people started really deeply changing their ecosystems. Another kind of myth that was busted for me was I tend to think of our ancient ancestors as people who lived in harmony with the land because they had to in order to survive. But again, he paints a different picture. It's a picture in which people swept through landscapes, using them and moving on, and in many cases, hunting animals to extinction many millennia before even the invention of agriculture, much less our modern world. All that said, our modern world, especially here in North America, has perpetrated a destruction that's nothing like has ever been seen before on this planet. So I think that this book, first of all, helps to acknowledge the damage done, but also see what were the mindset and the practices that caused so very much destruction. Who were the people? Who are we who did that? And then how can we be purposeful about how we want to live now, how we want to raise food and use land and coexist with the many species that have survived? By the way, I've done several other interviews with Dan Flores, and I will link to them in the show notes in case you want to hear about some of the other books he's written. So, now I would like to welcome Dan Flores to Down to Earth.
Thank you, Mary Charlotte. It's a great pleasure to be with you talking about fun things again.
Yes, indeed. It's great to have you back on the show. So, the book is called Wild New World, and the word new means more than one thing. We talk about the New World compared to the Europeans who came over here some centuries ago, but also human beings from much earlier periods and even animals. This is a new world. I mean, you could go back to, 60,000 years ago when the first humans left Africa, but talk about like that timeline. What's new about this continent?
Well, this is a book that is essentially a big history for people who have read Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*, for example. This is a book in that mold, or Jared Diamond's books, *Guns, Germs, and Steel* in particular. It's a book that bites off much bigger slices of time than normal history does. So this is actually a book that covers 66 million years ago. I started with the Chicxulub impact, which is the asteroid impact that took out the dinosaurs and ushered in the age of mammals. And I started there because that's the reset on creating the bestiary in North America that humans find here when we arrive a very, very long time later. But I felt obligated to begin the book because I take the animals seriously in this book. I wanted to give them their due and describe how North America acquired its animals, how in the wake of this Chicxulub impact we evolved certain classic creatures that are known around the world. Horses and camels, for example, come out of North American evolution and then spread elsewhere around the globe. And I also wanted to talk about how America was a new place for the many different animals that arrived from other parts of the world through migration that mostly went across the Bering Land Bridge when it formed, but there was some migration that came out of Western Europe as well. So the book has as its kind of model this deep history approach where it starts out trying to set up how America was a new place for all these creatures and how starting at least 23,000 years ago, we're certain of that date, human beings began arriving here. So the story sort of picks up at that point, and most of the book, frankly, is about the period since 1500, the last 500 years, since Old Worlders from Europe and Africa and elsewhere have been here. But the first 4 chapters essentially concentrate on this much earlier period.
Well, that much earlier period is really fascinating because, I mean, talk about some of the animals that were here. I mean, you talked about horses and camel-like animals that evolved here, but there were so many others too, many of which are extinct now, not all, but, giant cats and bison. Talk about some of those animals.
Yeah, well, probably the best way to sort of divvy them up into bite-sized pieces is to think of the ones that evolved here. So in addition to horses and camels, the canid family was one of the families of animals that evolved in North America and then spread around the world. So all the wolves, jackals, coyotes around the entire world. Of course, coyotes are only found here in North America, but jackals did leave and go elsewhere, as did wolves. Those all came out of North American evolution more than 5 million years ago.
And so the wolves and animals that we know in Europe and Asia came across the Bering Land Bridge the other way?
Yes, and that's one of the interesting things about the land bridge is we kind of tend to think of it as being this one-way street from Asia into America, but of course things that evolved here also went the other direction, which is how zebras got to Africa, how wild horses got to Asia, how horses got to Europe, how camels got to North Africa and the Middle East. All these animals emerged out of America and migrated across the land bridges to other parts of the world. So the same thing happened with wolves in particular. As I said, coyotes didn't leave. They remained original sort of native animals in America, but gray wolves did leave. In fact, they were gone long enough that for a couple of million years that they sort of evolved into a new form in Eurasia and then started coming back here in a series of waves about 25 or 30,000 years ago.
It's amazing that we know this.
It is amazing that we know it. And one of the ways that we know it, and this is one of the things that was kind of a goad to me to do this book, is that genomic science, which we've only had for the last couple of decades, has suddenly told us things about ancient history, how animals emerged, which other creatures they're related to, and fascinatingly enough, oftentimes what might have transpired with them, what might have happened to them, which is particularly important for the animals that became extinct. So this brand new science based on the genetic revolution has enabled us to suddenly know things about other creatures and about ourselves that we didn't know only 20 years ago.
Very interesting. Now, let's talk about early human beings on this continent, how they came here, what animals they encountered, and really they were part of a wave of extinctions that we don't really usually associate with indigenous people on this continent.
There was a article in the Academy of Sciences in 2018 that looked at the migration of humans out of Africa and around the world and argued essentially that 300 mammal species and more than 2.5 billion years of distinctive Earth genetics disappeared during the period when humans were migrating around the world, because a couple of things were important in that story. One is that we have been hunters of other creatures for 2 million years. And by the time 60,000 years ago that we began migrating around the world, getting to Asia and Siberia, and finally, as I mentioned a minute ago, by 23,000 years ago into North America, our experience, our economy rested on 35 to 40,000 generations of hunting. So we were really good at it, and we were also very interested in animals that had never encountered us before, because we recognized from the very first that those innocent, naive creatures did not look upon humans as being a threat to their safety. This is called biological first contact, when animals have to learn how to fear humans. And what these early humans were doing, I mean, they were us. They were Homo sapiens. They were anatomically modern humans. So they were just as smart as we are. Their brains were just as big, but they were particularly skilled at hunting. And one of the things they looked for were places where the animals were innocent.
Meaning kind of tame?
Tame. I mean, so tame, in fact, that they simply didn't recognize humans as a threat. I mean, there are examples of this going into the 19th century in America, where animals simply would allow humans to walk up to them, pluck birds out of the trees with their hands. There's a sort of a horrific story from the Falkland Islands of a particular fox that was found there, and the hunters on that island would offer a tidbit to lure the fox in, and while it was eating out of their left hand, they would stab it with a knife with the right hand. So animals that had never encountered humans before spent oftentimes a long, lengthy period of habituating themselves to human predation. And when these humans with this kind of skill arrived among animals like that, they were capable of taking them out fairly easily. I mean, one of the things I argue in this book, and that 2018 article I just mentioned from the Academy of Sciences is one of the things that gave me the key to it, is that what we today call the sixth extinction, which we think of as a very modern thing, has actually been going on for probably 25 or 30,000 years. It's just been going on in slow motion as kind of a background noise, and it's anthropogenic. It's caused by humans, but we have been doing it for a very, very long time, wiping out particularly animals that were innocent to us as predators.
And what were some of those animals on this continent?
I use the description of the animals at La Brea Tar Pits in downtown LA as sort of my opportunity to describe what the bestiary was that humans found. And so, I mean, it included, for one thing, if you've ever been to La Brea, one of the things you notice as soon as you get out of your taxi or your Uber or your Lyft, are the sounds of trumpeting elephants. And what these are robotic mammoths caught in the tar and, of course, are trumpeting their despair at being unable to escape. So mammoths, North America had elephants. Those were one of the creatures that we found, mammoths and mastodons, when we first got here. North America was evidently a remarkable habitat for 4 different species of mammoths and at least a couple of species of mastodons. We found also the predators of animals like that. Saber-toothed cats, for example, and scimitar cats were the predators of elephant or mammoth calves. We found a whole series of wolves. One of the wolves that had evolved in North America and didn't leave and go anywhere else, that had stayed here, was one called the dire wolf. And whenever you visit La Brea and the museum there, one of the most striking aspects of the museum is this illuminated wall with the skulls of almost 300 dire wolves that have been taken out of the asphalt there, that of course were lured in by the sounds of dying and trapped animals. There were all sorts of predatory birds like eagles, and there were scavenging birds like condors. The California condor, in fact, was one of the smaller of the scavenging birds of this particular period. There were giant teratorns that were probably twice the size of a California condor because there was such a biomass of dead animals as a result of the really rich diversity that was found in North America. And there were horses and camels and deer and elk. And I used the first chapter of the book describing how many of these animals either evolved here or migrated here at various times. And of course, there were bison.
Giant bison.
Giant bison. There were at least 2 species of giant bison during the Pleistocene when humans first arrived. One called Bison latifrons had a horn spread of 8 or 9 feet. It was a gigantic animal. Those became extinct fairly early on, probably about the time humans were first appearing in numbers here. But the animal that remained in America down to about 10,000 years ago and was hunted, and I opened the book actually with the description of the type archaeological site, the Folsom site in New Mexico, where we first discovered that these bison were being hunted by early humans, is an animal called Bison antiquus, the antique bison, about twice the size of a modern bison. And modern bison, which emerged with the loss of these earlier larger animals, are considered by some biologists to be kind of a dwarf species. Now, this is an animal that weighs 2,000 pounds or more, but nonetheless, we think of them as, compared to these earlier creatures, a much smaller animal.
And so human beings basically were the cause of their demise. Long before the Industrial Revolution and even colonization, what happened? Were there gestation periods just so long that they just didn't produce enough animals to keep up with what humans were killing?
Well, the answer to that is it's complex, and it also tends to be specific sometimes for particular species. But here's what we think now, and we've been struggling, and by we I mean the scientific community has been struggling trying to explain this for a very long time. Since in the early 19th century, we began finding the fossils of creatures like this and first began considering the idea of extinction, which Europeans didn't believe in, by the way. Their religion taught them that extinction didn't happen. But over time, by the 1820s or so, scientists began to realize, well, extinction is for sure real. Here are animals that are not found anywhere else on Earth. They obviously were here at one time. What happened to them? So we've been puzzling over this question for 200 years, essentially. Only in the last probably 20 or 25 years has the paleontological community and the archaeological community begun to kind of coalesce around the idea that humans almost certainly were a major factor in producing the extinctions of most of these species. But it's not as simple as these superlative hunters arrive and they just kill everything in sight. It seems to be, and this is another one of the insights we've gotten from genomic science, it seems to be something more like this, where humans arrive, they began taking out populations of animals like mammoths, which do have a very long gestation period, and it's hard for them to reproduce to keep up a population. But what also happens, and we know this primarily from the fate of the last mammoths that were on Wrangel Island in the Bering Sea, that survived down to 4,000 years ago. They were isolated on an island. Humans did not get there. The climate changes that some people used to argue might have caused the extinctions have mostly fallen out of favor as a possible solution to this dilemma. So these animals would have lived through the end of the Pleistocene and the emergence of the modern climate regime. No problem with that. But they disappeared. And the reason they seem to have disappeared is because small populations of animals with a very narrow genetic diversity can reach a point where they don't have enough genetic randomness in their population to continue to produce. And the result...
So they were inbred.
They were inbred to the point where they reached a stage where they couldn't reproduce anymore. And what we think may have happened, which is one of the worries of conservation biology today with all kinds of animals, is that without connectivity, these populations that would have been separated from one another by maybe hundreds of miles and couldn't exchange genes would have become susceptible to something like genomic meltdown. So it's not so much that humans just killed everything in sight, it's that they often would kill enough numbers of animals that they would fall into these distinct populations that were separate from one another and have difficulty exchanging genes and surviving.
Well, that was on an island, but here on the mainland, so to speak, I mean, we were also pretty effective hunters. Is that not right?
Extremely effective hunters. Yeah. One of the stories I tell in the book, and this is the second chapter, which is called Clovisia the Beautiful, because I describe in it the emergence of the first coast-to-coast culture in America 13,000 years ago, which consists of the first group of really professional hunters who are able to, unlike the 23,000-year-old groups that probably came by boat along the coastline, these people came out of Siberia through what's called the Mackenzie Corridor, which is an ice-free corridor from Alaska into present-day Alberta. And they arrived in numbers rather than just as little small pockets of people. And these people, who we call the Clovis people as a result of the little town of Clovis, New Mexico, having been near the first site where the Clovis culture was discovered, they were basically kind of professional hunters, and they specialized in particular on mammoths. And so one of the stories I tell in the chapter Clovisia the Beautiful is about this particular hunt that we know took place on and near the Santa Cruz River south of today's Tucson, probably about 13,000 years ago, where a group of these Clovis hunters surround a band of mammoths that consists apparently of a bull, a cow, and 13 adolescents and calves. These hunters, when archaeologists found the 3 sites that make up this story, the first site they found was of the 13 adolescents and calves with 13 Clovis points in them. 1 Clovis point for each animal, all found in one spot.
Spear points.
Spear points, that's right. Points that you have to drive in with your own power, your own physical power as a hunter. 13 points for 13 young animals. Then they found the bull with 2 points in the bull a few miles away, and finally found the cow, who quite obviously had fought to the end trying to defend her young. She died with 8 Clovis points in her. But as far as we've been able to tell, these hunters killed every single animal in that band of mammoths. It's an example, I think, of how good they were at this.
Well, and 1 spear per animal.
Yeah, 1 per animal, for the young ones at least.
Now, I mean, there's some myths that are getting busted in this book, and one of them is that early human beings lived in harmony with nature. And in fact, what it looks like is they moved from ecosystem to ecosystem, kind of using things up and moving on to greener pastures where there were more animals that they could hunt, and laying waste. And I mean, did they, okay, here's this huge slaughter of animals. Did they eat all of it? Did they, did they use every, quote unquote, every part of the animal?
Of course, they weren't able to do that. For one thing, they don't have refrigeration. They don't have, when you kill something like a mammoth, I mean, you've got an awful lot of meat to try to process. I mean, you can dry it, and that was one way to preserve the meat. But, I mean, I start a chapter that's on the next phase of the book, which is the 10,000 year period that follows this Pleistocene extinction, which, by the way, took out all of the big Africa-like animals that we had in North America. I mean, we lost all our big cats, our lions, our ground sloths, our mammoths, our mastodons. They all disappeared by 10,000 years ago.
By our hand, pretty much.
Pretty much by our hand. I mean, there are some animals that we think probably, we think, for example, that gray wolves, as they began coming back into North America from their continued evolution in Eurasia, after they had left North America and continued to evolve and then began coming back, that they probably just outcompeted dire wolves. And so there are several examples of animals that are outcompeted by their sort of progeny, animals that do a similar thing that may in fact have been related to them in the evolutionary chain, but were better at a particular kind of lifestyle and occupation and new conditions than the older animals were. So it's not completely humans, as I have been trying to sort of say. We think, this genomic meltdown may have played a role, that certainly some animals were outcompeted by others, but it's hard to avoid the fact that for animals like mammoths, the reason we don't have elephants in North America is because these early humans probably wiped them out, or certainly pushed them to the edge of extinction.
Now, that was followed by a period, as you say, of 10,000 years where people did live more in harmony with their environment. Do you have any sense of whether there was a self-awareness of like, oh man, we just wiped everybody out, we better do something different?
Well, it's difficult to answer that. I mean, I pose that question myself and try to say what I can about it. The fact is, these people were not writing down their history. Strangely enough, I mean, because the same thing happened in Europe at roughly the same period of time. Western Europeans wiped out almost all of the big Africa-like animals in Europe. And the reason, by the way, that we preserve animals like horses and camels and wild aurochs, wild cattle in Europe, is because Europeans began undergoing what's called the Neolithic Revolution, the revolution of domestication, about 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. And so they saved the last groups of horses and camels and others by domesticating them, which is how we managed to preserve them in Europe. But that same process happened in other parts of the world, not just in North America. It certainly happened in South America too. Whether or not they had some kind of sense of, man, we really screwed this up and we need to play the game differently, is harder to figure out, in part because unlike in Europe and Western Europe, where people did this remarkable kind of portrayal of godlike animals on the walls of caves in the Ardèche River Valley of France, for example. We don't have anything like that in North America. There's very little by the way of visual representation from the Clovis and Folsom period. It's like they regarded their hunting tools as their primary art, and they didn't proceed to do some sort of capturing of the visual look of the world that they inhabited. So we don't have anything to go on, really, but what we do have is this succeeding 10,000 year time period when everything starts to look different. These big animals are gone, or a lot of them are. I mean, a bison survives. It's, as I said, a smaller version of these bigger bison that had once been in America. A lot of the animals that had come out of Eurasia to North America, elk, deer, wild sheep, wild goats, bears, those survive. And one of the explanations for that is that, well, these had been animals that had been used to the human presence for a very, very long period of time.
Meaning they were scared of us?
They were scared of us. They recognized us as predators and knew how to respond to that, as opposed to the naive ones who we found who had never seen humans before.
And which, just as an aside, because I want you to go on, but is it's really important to acknowledge that, because it's part of the understanding that animals have culture and they transmit the knowledge, like, hey, those guys over there are really dangerous, stay away from them.
Absolutely. And I go to some links throughout the book to demonstrate animal culture. I mean, it's really evident, for example, in the wolf story in America. But here we have this 10,000 year period where, as far as I could determine, in contrast to the earlier period that had lasted, say, 3,000 or so years, where there had been numerous extinctions, in this 10,000 year period that follows down to the and ends basically with the arrival of Europeans from the Old World, there was only one extinction. And that happened to be a flightless coastal sea duck on the Pacific coast. And I have to observe that flightless birds were often the easiest prey for humans to take out all around the world. So in Australia, New Zealand, the Hawaiian Islands, all over the globe, basically, where there were flightless birds and humans arrive on the scene for the first time. Flightless birds usually don't last very long. And in North America, to be sure, we lost a flightless duck. But otherwise, although there's certainly good evidence that the populations of some animals may have been suppressed by hunting them, there's good evidence that for 10,000 years, humans managed to preserve the biological diversity of North America. And so I tried to understand that. I was going to tell a story a few minutes ago about the way I opened this chapter is by going to a buffalo jump in Montana, and one morning before daybreak, climbing on top of this mesa and going back to the prairie where I knew that bison herds would often be startled and encouraged to begin to run towards the drop-off. And so what I was trying to do was to grapple with the fact that this bison jump as a form of hunting is clearly not a strategy for using every particle of the animal that's killed, because there are instances, I mean, we know of a site, for example, in Texas, where a buffalo jump produced so many animals going off the cliff, and they piled up so deeply at the bottom of this cliff that they burst into spontaneous combustion, and their bodies all burned up and blackened this cliff face for hundreds of feet high. So it's impossible for a strategy like that for you to use up all the animals. But nonetheless, despite approaches like the buffalo jump, as I said, there's all this evidence that's offered by European journalists, for one thing, when they first arrived here 500 years ago, that the biological diversity of America is intact. The passenger pigeons are here, the wolves are here, the bison are here, I mean, on and on and on. Our northern hemisphere penguins, the great auks, are here, and several other species I'll talk about in a minute. And so the question in that chapter is, how did they do it? How did they manage to do it? Well, I came up with about 3 or 4 explanations for what they did. And one of them, admittedly, has struck some people as a little bit draconian, but these people, 10,000 years of time, very carefully controlled their populations. And they did so by a variety of means. They spaced out births, human births, for one thing, which often meant feeding breast milk to their children until they were 5 or 6 years old, which has a way of delaying ovulation. But one of the primary means that they used to basically to keep their population in check with the carrying capacity of a hunting and gathering continent was they engaged in infanticide. When they had unwanted children, they killed them. I mean, it was a form of abortion, post-birth abortion, in fact. And they did this because they recognized full well that hunting and gathering is a human economy that requires lots of open space and lots of animals and a small predatory population of humans. So this is one strategy. Another thing they did was, because North America was settled later than Europe was and Asia was, America goes through a Neolithic revolution. We go through a revolution of domesticating particularly plants, not really animals so much, but plants. So we have an agricultural revolution. But it's not going to happen for 5,000 or 6,000 years after the one happens in Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa. And the Neolithic revolution, when you have farming, that allows your population to grow. And so that particular stage in the human story in North America happened significantly later in time, which helped keep the population down. Another interesting aspect, and there are 2 other things I'll mention, although they domesticated plants in America and domesticated a couple of animals, they had dogs, they domesticated turkeys as a poultry stock, they didn't domesticate herding animals the way old worlders did. And the reason that's important, and it makes such a huge difference when old worlders arrive with their way of doing things, is that when you start herding animals, you begin to develop an animus towards predators. And so by not herding deer or pronghorns or buffalo or bighorn sheep, by leaving those animals wild and just hunting them, it meant that native people in the Americas never developed this idea of you've got to wipe out all the predators. You've got to kill all the lions. You've got to kill all the wolves. That never happened. And that allowed the ecologies of North America with the keystone animals on top to be preserved. And the last thing I will say is, and this is perhaps the most important one of all, and I argue in the book at least, that this is a legacy of the way we used to think about ourselves with respect to other animals. We did not think of ourselves as necessarily exceptional to other creatures. There is ample evidence from native people that they continued right down to, well, really, for many people down to the present day, they continue to think of animals as part of a kinship community that humans were in. And so they preserve this idea that you have to engage with animals, you have to do ceremonies to satisfy them. If you violate the taboos against treating them respectfully, they can leave, and you have to do ceremonies to bring them back so that the animals come dancing, as the stories put it. And that idea of seeing humans not as exceptional but as kin to all other creatures, I mean, the truth is, of course, it's a Darwinian idea, except in the Western world, we don't realize that this idea is valid until, well, Darwin wrote his first book 163 years ago. So it's a very late recognition in the Eurasian old world tradition, but something that native people in America preserve down through the ages.
So the rest of the book is about the incredible destruction of wildlife on the part of Europeans as they colonized this continent. And, it's funny, I was thinking as I was reading it, I mean, we talk about the United States being built on the backs of slaves and native people and immigrants. But reading your book, it's clear that this continent was built, this country was built on the backs of animals, of wildlife. The deaths of countless millions of animals, many of which are now extinct after those 10,000 years of relative equilibrium. And there's a number of different reasons for this slaughter, and I'd like to talk about each of them. One was, as you say, the old world European attitudes about predators, for example, wolves. Tell us, I mean, it's so harrowing to read. I mean, it's hard to read, but it's important to talk about what happened when Europeans got here and encountered these apex predators, these wolves and coyotes.
Yes, and lions and bears and
Yeah.
animals, jaguars that had been, of course, here shaping ecologies in America all along. Things were relatively intact, at least the last 10,000 years of the American bestiary were intact when Europeans arrive. And of course, they describe, and I spend some time talking about the naturalists from Europe who are just intoxicated with all the creatures that they've never encountered before. Europeans describe the diversity of the wildlife they're finding, the magic of it, really. And they're quite stunned at it because they came from traditions where wild animals had mostly been obliterated in the old world. And so this was finding animals in such abundance and in such ecological health was a brand new thing for Europeans.
And not really in their cultural memories so much.
Not in their cultural memories because, well, for example, there hadn't been any wolves in the British Isles since the 1400s. And so when people arrive in the early 1600s in places like Massachusetts Bay, I mean, the whole idea of there being wolves was an utter shock to them. In fact, as I point out in the book, the very first environmental law old worlders ever pass in America, it's in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, is a bounty on wolves. First thing they do is to take a look around and, oh my God, we've got to get rid of these things. So from the very beginning, they start this process that, of course, comes from 8,000 years of domesticating sheep and goats and cattle and regarding as herding culture people do, predators as being the enemy that you have to erase. But it's all then kind of translated into a religious approach with the adoption in Western Europe a few hundred, 1,200, 1,500 years before of the Judeo-Christian ethic. Because in that ethic, the story of predators is that these were created when Adam transgressed and suffered the so-called fall and had to leave the Garden of Eden and entered a world of briars and brambles and predators. And so the whole idea of getting rid of predators, as had happened in most of Western Europe hundreds of years before these people got to North America, was that you were restoring the world to God's original creation as Adam and Eve had seen it by getting rid of these animals. I mean, one of the stories I tell in the book is, these comments that early European colonists make, particularly along the Atlantic shore, that, I mean, look at these wolves. Their eyes, just like Satan in the text, their eyes are yellow. So they're clearly evil. And there's something that you have to erase from the world if you're going to make the world into something like old Europe or the Garden of Eden. And, the stories are really pretty horrible, even though these early commenters make the statement that Wow. In contrast to our folklore about wolves, these wolves in America don't seem to be a threat to anybody. They don't seem to attack anybody. They don't bite anybody. They occasionally seem to take a hog or a calf, but they're not a threat to people. Nonetheless, we're going to wipe them out just as fast as we can.
And so it's a funny thing because on the one hand, you want to wipe them all out, and on the other hand, there's this idea that you can't have extinction because everything that God created has always existed and will always exist.
Yes, the Europeans arrived with an ideology that basically is probably very old. I mean, the sources of it that we know of come from the Greeks, from Aristotle and Plato in particular. But it's a model of the world called the Great Chain of Being, which is this kind of hierarchy of God and angels and humans, and then all other animals arrayed below in descending order based on their utility to humans on Earth. But the idea of the Great Chain of Being is that it was created all at once, or in the biblical tradition, over 6 days, and it was created as perfection. And since it was perfect, and everything was fashioned by a supreme being, everything would last forever without change. I mean, clearly, this contrasted with what one observed with one's own senses, that if you hunted animals near the colonies, they began to diminish in number. But everyone meaning Europeans, assumed that it was impossible to make animals extinct because the creation was perfect, and therefore everything would survive just as God had fashioned it without change through time. This is why it was such a struggle in the early 19th century for science to finally convince people that extinction was a real thing.
And we'll get to that because it's a very important change, philosophical and psychological change, as well as the roots of conservation. But meanwhile, there was, and especially, as people moved out, as Europeans and their descendants moved out to the West, a level of killing which was so cruel that it's hard to fathom. Poisoning which left animals writhing in pain and then poisoned all the other animals that came near them or ate their flesh, and people didn't seem to be bothered by it.
No, they didn't seem to be bothered by it, and it's so some parts of the book, I will admit, seem like an elegy. I will say that the book ends up being an optimistic book, and I'll explain why that's the case a little bit later. But first, the slaughter. So just to give your listeners some sense of this, and I've said this before in another book of mine that I worked on several years ago, and came to this conclusion when I was doing research trying to figure out if there had been an analog anywhere else in the world. But I use this line in Wild New World as well. In the last 400 years, from the 1600s up to the present day, up to really to the early 1900s or early 20th century, say from 1620 to 1920, that's 300 years. That's only 3 centuries. There were creatures that had been here, like passenger pigeons, for 15 million years, undiminished in numbers, and they could not survive 3 centuries of our presence.
And they were the most abundant bird species on the planet.
On the planet, yeah. Not just in
Billions.
North America. Billions of them. We think probably somewhere between 6 and 10 billion of them. They had been here, as I said, for millions and millions of years, and old worlders show up, and these birds can't survive 3 centuries. And that's true of one species after another, of great auks, of our tropical parrots, Carolina parakeets, we got whooping cranes down to 16 birds that were left. We almost lost trumpeter swans. We lost the eastern prairie chicken, the heath hen. we've obviously declared extinct by the Fish and Wildlife Service last year, lost ivory-bill woodpeckers, our candidate for the largest, most charismatic woodpecker in the world. I mean, and many of the mammal species were reduced to the point where we had to basically go to Hail Mary heroics to save the last few and repopulate. I mean, bison fall into that category. Pronghorn antelope fall into that category. Bighorn sheep. On and on and on. We pushed animals, if we didn't cause them to completely disappear, to the point of there just being a few hundred of them. Bison from probably 30 million down to 1,000. And it is, and this is the line that I use in the book, it is the largest destruction of animal life that you can find anywhere in world history. We did it here in the United States over a 3-century-long period of time. So it's something to not only understand and know about, but it's something to contend with in terms, as you said a minute ago, of building the greatest country on earth, which is what we think America is, on the pelts and the bones and the body parts of millions upon millions of animals. And in order to do that, you have to bring to that game a couple of kind of ideologies in your mind. You first have to think of yourself as superior to every other kind of animal on the planet. I tell a story in the book, and it's one of the reasons I wrote this book, because this story has haunted me my whole life. It's actually my oldest memory. I'm 4 years old. Growing up in Louisiana, I am a kid who is in a small town, and as a result of that, of having grandparents who have a farm a couple of miles away, I grew up with animals. And my first animal is a little chicken who, at 4 years old, not being that imaginative, I named Chicky. And Chicky, as my first animal companion, becomes one of my first playmates. And Chicky and I chase through the house underneath sewing machines and coffee tables and in and out behind the couch until one day I'm 4 years old and probably a little clumsy, and I misjudge and I step on my chicken and I kill it. And so I'm clearly devastated by this, and my mother and I go out in the backyard and we wrap Chicky up in some sort of little box and dig a hole and put him in the ground. And as we're standing there, both of us sobbing, I know I was sobbing and my mother probably was too, I posed this question to my mother. I said, "So Mom, I'm going to get to have Chicky again in heaven, aren't I?" And her response to that, I didn't realize it at 4 years old, but I ultimately came to realize, I think probably when I went to college maybe, that she had summed up the whole Western world idea of the relationship between human beings and other animals. Because her response was, "Well, honey, no, you're not going to get to see Chicky in heaven. You are made in the image of God, and you have an immortal soul, so you'll get to go to heaven. Chicky is just an animal. Animals don't go to heaven. When they die, animals just die." I mean, even at 4 years old, as I remember this, I kind of thought, that can't be right. That can't be the way things are. But it was a summary of how Europeans viewed the world. They thought of themselves as made in the image of a deity, as the only creatures with everlasting and immortal souls, and everything else. I mean, Genesis says it about other animals. Into your hand are they delivered. They are yours to use in any way you wish. And settling North America with all the resources that were available that Europeans had long since depleted in their circumstance, all the trees, all the gold and silver, all the possibilities, including all these animals, beavers and sea otters and fur seals and bison and passenger pigeons, on and on and on. Europeans simply turned them into commodities in the global market economy.
Well, that's the other side of it. I mean, you have this philosophical thing that animals don't have souls and that we're superior to them, and this sort of ideological religious thing. But then it gets turned into this just absolutely raw market commodity phenomenon. And between those two things, the animals didn't have a chance.
No, they don't have a chance. And I mean, it's a complicated, fascinating story because, and I offer several examples of this in the book, turning animals, wild animals, into market commodities is one of the things, oddly enough, that enables many Americans, particularly rural Americans who live in places where it's difficult to make cash. And of course, a cash economy is what America is gradually becoming. But you can kill animals. You can kill passenger pigeons.
Was there a big market for passenger pigeons?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Not just for the dinner table of restaurants in places like Chicago and Boston and New York, but passenger pigeons sort of late in the game were basically used as livestock food. And so you killed them. I mean, you didn't get as much money for the ones that were destined for hog farms, for example, but that's what they were often used for in the last stages of the game, is just feeding livestock, particularly hogs, in order to foster that particular economy.
And so part of the word freedom, which is one of these words that we love here in America, part of what freedom meant was freedom to kill animals.
It did, yeah. John Stuart Mill's definition of freedom, is one that Americans embrace wholeheartedly, along with Adam Smith's idea of how capitalist markets work. I mean, we are all in on all those models, and one of the ways we translate those models into reality is by killing animals, by not suffering anyone, any government. Like, for example, the British government in the years before the American Revolution. One of the ways the British government really pissed Americans off was by telling them, look, we're going to have to stop the deer hunt in America. You guys are wiping out all the white-tailed deer killed for the leather trade primarily. So we're going to stop the deer hunt, and we're going to prevent you from going across the Appalachian Allegheny Mountains and hunting in the Mississippi Valley, because we're going to preserve those animals for a later stage of development. Americans were completely unwilling to tolerate that, and not only do they become furious with the British government for those kinds of implied and imposed restrictions, but throughout much of the 19th century into the 20th century, Americans, whenever states try to pass legislation to control the hunting of animals, I mean, Americans just completely ignore those laws. And in fact, there's a rash in the early 20th century of when finally people began hiring game wardens. I mean, a game warden has no lifespan. They get shot down by people who have been used to hunting animals without any kind of restrictions whatsoever.
Part of the story of the American West that we all know about is the extermination of the buffalo, the bison, and part of that story is the government program to destroy the Native American people. What actually happened? What did that look like?
Well, I take that particular story on because it's been accepted pretty uncritically for a long time. So let me, just for your listeners, kind of recast what was happening in the period after the Civil War. Civil War ends in 1865. There are, at this point, probably, because bison have been hunted for the market, particularly, interestingly enough, by native people for the market who kill buffalo, have their wives, girlfriends, lovers, multiple wives in some cases, tan the hides in order to produce what are called bison robes, which are softly tanned robes or pelts with the hair on one side and very soft on the other side. That's been going on as a trade item since the 1820s, alongside the beaver trade, the killing of beavers for the market in order to make beaver hats. And these bison robes processed by native people were basically used as cold weather covering for people, not just in America, but in Europe as well.
And so they really just got kind of pulled into this whole commodification ethic and weren't really inoculated by their own, very powerful traditions of living in equilibrium with the animals.
Yes, I spend quite a bit of time explaining how this worked. I mean, essentially what happened when Europeans arrive in America is that they arrive having been the recipients of a technological revolution that allows Europeans to partake of inventions in Asia, gunpowder, in northern Africa, compasses and astrolabes for navigation, all over the largest landmass of the world, which of course is connected together. So this is sort of the theme of Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond's famous book that won the Pulitzer Prize 20 or so years ago. That this is how Europeans come to have a technology that is it's miraculous for native people who have not yet gone through the Iron Age. And so when Europeans arrive with metalware and goods from the Industrial Revolution, with guns, with hoes, with knives, with swords, with all manner of goods, native people are going to quickly realize that you either participate in this economy and you engage with these people and acquire these goods, or if you don't, you're quickly going to disadvantage yourself, and all the people around you who do engage with the Europeans are going to basically succeed while you fail. So there is a motive for trading whatever you have in order to acquire this new technology. And the one thing you have that the Europeans want are the pelts and the leather and the skins of animals. And so from the very beginning of the European arrival, native people are basically caught up in the market economy. They began hunting animals, beavers and otters and white-tailed deer, in order to trade to Europeans for this brand new metalware technology. And that story translates across the centuries and from the Atlantic seaboard all the way across the American West until it becomes part of the buffalo story. So that buffalo robe that I was describing a minute ago is the 19th century equivalent of killing white-tailed deer, for example, in Virginia in order to trade the skins of deer to Europeans. Same thing happens with buffalo. Native people get caught up in the market economy for the products of the buffalo. But after the Civil War, as a result of a number of factors that have played out since the 1830s, from the 1830s to the 1860s, the buffalo herds in the American West, they've not only been concentrated into the American West, pushed from both directions onto essentially the Great Plains, which is their core area, but they've not only been pushed into that region, but they've also probably been reduced in number from something like maybe 30 million animals down to 10 or 12 million by 1865. And the factors that have brought that about are numerous, and I won't elaborate on them, but the return of horses to North America has been one of the things that diminishes the carrying capacity of the West for buffalo, because as horses get loose and become wild animals and start sort of replicating the Pleistocene alongside the bison herds, they're eating the same grass, they're drinking the same water, and so their presence as horse numbers increase means that buffalo numbers begin to decrease. There's a competitor with buffalo now for the habitat of the West. We also are convinced that there probably were exotic animal diseases that were brought west by the overland migrants. And one disease that we're pretty sure bison acquired in the middle of the 19th century was anthrax. Another was probably bovine tuberculosis, because we know that the last bison that were collected in the 1880s had those diseases. And so at some point in the 19th century, bison, just as native people had had caught diseases from old worlders earlier in the story. Now animals are catching diseases that are brought over from the old world. So there are a variety of factors that contribute to this diminishment in bison numbers, and one other that I feel obligated to kind of mention is climate. We know now that starting in about 1850 and lasting till about 1865, the West, especially the Bison Range country on the Great Plains, suffered a really severe drought. And a 15-year drought, which we think, climatologists think, is probably one of the most severe western droughts in the last couple of thousand years, it affected the grass cover of the Great Plains, and that reduced how many buffalo could graze and be carried by the capacity of the Great Plains for big animals. So, as I said, we think probably by 1865, maybe 10 million, possibly 12 million buffalo are all that are left. The numbers are still enormous, but at this point, just as had happened with the white-tailed deer trade earlier, which was a leather trade, people in Europe and the East managed to invent a chemical tanning process for buffalo leather to turn it into a very strong, durable product that gets used in the Industrial Revolution for things like belting to drive machines. And suddenly, it's not so much the bison robe processed by Indian labor that's in demand. Suddenly, it's just the raw hides of buffalo that become the product of demand at the moment. And what this translates to is a population of former Civil War soldiers from both the Confederacy and the Union who basically arm themselves, go out onto the Great Plains, and begin in an industrial process, wiping out buffalo, killing them, stripping their hides off, discarding the bodies and all the meat. Occasionally they'll cut the tongues out because there's a demand in restaurants for buffalo tongues. But what they're really after is just the hide. So this is the famous hide hunt of the buffalo hunters in the period after the Civil War. Now here's where the story gets interesting, and here's where the explanation for what happened to the buffalo comes in. In the early 20th century, when Teddy Roosevelt is president, there's this phenomenon called the conservation movement. It's the first time in American history where not only an American president, but groups like the Sierra Club are talking about preserving nature, preserving forests, rivers, even animals. And some of those conservationists are talking with a great degree of disgust about the destruction of all these animals, particularly buffalo, that had taken place in the 19th century, where we had wiped them down to fewer than 1,000 animals in the middle of the 1880s. One of the former buffalo hunters, a guy named John Cook, in 1905 wrote a memoir of his time as a buffalo hunter. And the story of the government being responsible for wiping out the buffalo basically comes from his memoir. What John Cook essentially said was that he and other buffalo hunters like him were actually agents of the federal government who were given free ammunition, he said, to go out and kill the buffalo because the buffalo was preserving native culture and survival on the Great Plains. And so Cook's argument was that the military and the federal government had engaged in a secret conspiracy to arm buffalo hunters to go out and kill these animals. Now, this is a story that was fairly simple to disprove, except in the 20th century, nobody seemed interested in disproving it. I think because any other explanation didn't cast capitalism and American expansion in a very good light. And what people came to believe then about the buffalo story was that the reason we had no more buffalo was that the government had done it. The government had killed them in order to control Indians.
But it wasn't true.
Well, I mean, here's what I would say. Plenty of readers are going to have books in their libraries that will say this. And you can go to almost any library in the United States and you'll find a dozen or 15 books that basically have absorbed the John Cook argument that these buffalo hunters were, they were bringers of civilization and they did this at the behest of the government. Cook told a couple of stories in his book that were fairly easy to check out. And so when I first began working on this story quite a number of years ago, I began trying to determine whether or not he was telling the truth about some of this. And one of the stories he told was about the government of Texas getting ready to pass a law in 1875 to stop the killing of buffalo in West Texas, upon which point Philip Sheridan, who was the, of course, famous Civil War hero, who was the commander of the Western military, journeyed from Chicago to Austin to make a plea to the Texas legislature not to do this because, and Cook even reproduces the supposed speech that Sheridan made in the Texas legislature, that these buffalo hunters are agents of civilization, and once they kill these buffalo off, we're going to be able to control the Indians, and the cowboys and their festive cattle will spread across the Great Plains. I mean, Cook basically ends the story with saying the government really wanted to give us medals as heroes. They didn't want to castigate us as these environmental destructionists. They thought we were heroic. Well, the problem with that story is it's fairly easy to check out whether or not, A, the Texas government ever considered passing such a bill, and B, whether or not Philip Sheridan ever testified before the Texas legislature, and both of those things turned out to be utterly false.
So basically what you're saying is that it wasn't a government conspiracy to get rid of the Indians, it was pure unfettered capitalism.
It was unfettered capitalism at a time when the United States federal government had never lifted a finger to stop the destruction of any animals in American history. The federal government had never tried to stop the destruction of beavers that almost wiped beavers out by the 1840s. They had never tried to stop the destruction of white-tailed deer in the East, as the British government had attempted to do. The American federal government did not lift a finger to stop the slaughter of passenger pigeons that was happening at the same time that bison were being wiped out. And I will say that Congress tried to pass on two different occasions a bill to stop the destruction of buffalo in the West. It passed Congress, both houses, in 1874, but President Grant neglected to sign the bill into law. 2 years later, understanding that Grant was not opposed to the bill, the people who had put it up for a vote in 1874 put exactly the same bill up to pass in 1876. And that year it passed the House resoundingly, but it got tied up in a Senate committee and never did get out of committee. And so we just basically let what happened to the buffalo happen.
But we also let what happened to the native people happen.
We did indeed, yes. And there are plenty of people, the Secretary of the Interior, for example, Columbus Delano, who made comments like, I wouldn't be disappointed to see the buffalo gone, because it will help us in assimilating native people. What we want them to do is to become farmers and live on plots of land and not continue as hunters. And so it would be nice if perhaps the buffalo weren't there to act as a temptation.
There's a couple of more reasons that animals were getting killed in such a brutal way. One of them is sport hunting, trophy hunting, this kind of, you tell some of these harrowing stories, and this wasn't capitalism itself. It was the joy of hunting, the joy of killing. Even Teddy Roosevelt, who we think of as one of the fathers of conservation, killed thousands, if not tens of thousands of animals. It was for what? Sport, ego, machismo, joy in killing? Like, how do you understand it?
Well, I think it has to do with, for one thing, a preservation of the instinct for this ancient human economy. I mean, we had been doing this for 40 or 50,000 generations. And so hunting animals was sort of part of who humans were. We were long-term carnivores and predators. And so it was an intrinsic or inherent part of who we were. But some of the stories you allude to, for example, the safari hunts of St. George Gore in Wyoming in the 1850s, these were elite European noblemen who pursued the manly field sports, as they call them, all over the world. Africa was one of the places that Gore went, along with the American West. And so it's part of this, I think, in some respects, the elite sportsman's manly desire to impose a kind of power over the world, not just over other people, but over other animals. And Gore is probably the most egregious example of it.
It's so disgusting.
Yeah,
that chapter.
It's a pretty disgusting story. And of course, there are several others. There's the Earl of Dunraven, and I end that particular chapter with a story of him hunting a grizzly bear in the Paradise Valley in Montana. And of also in his case, because he tended to associate with writers and painters and actors, people who had a more sensitive bent. The Earl of Dunraven was at least sensitive enough to understand at one point, which is how I end that particular chapter, he's out on an elk hunt where he and his companions have ridden into a herd of elk, and they basically shot every animal in sight. They just shoot every animal they can find and wipe out the entire herd. And then he sits there on the ground and looks around and has this sudden feeling of, wow, it's completely silent. The whole country is empty. It's the most depressing thing I've ever experienced. And he's the agent of it. But he at least understands and is willing to write it in his journal, which is why we still have his words about this, that he's witnessed and has helped perpetuate sort of the devastation of American wildlife for no other reason than just the adrenaline excitement of riding among these animals and shooting every one he can.
And then there's one more contributor that I want to talk at least briefly about to the killing of wild animals, and that was science itself, the collecting of specimens for science and for natural history museums. And that was a lot of animals, too.
Yes, it was a lot of animals, and we think, for example, with the Carolina parakeet, I mean, most Americans, don't even realize anymore that we had a native parrot in North America, two subspecies of it. They range from the Atlantic seaboard all the way to Colorado and up into the Midwest, and as far as the Hudson River Valley on the eastern seaboard. They were almost the size of a crow, preserved this gorgeous tropical color of greens and turquoise blues and chromium yellows, and flew in these gaudy flocks through the trees of the east. And those birds, we think, probably had their demise significantly contributed to by naturalists collecting them for museums. I mean, there's an episode I describe in the book where one of the members of the Audubon Society, who had been a prominent player in exposing what was called the plume trade, the killing of birds like snowy egrets and roseate spoonbills for their plumage feathers to decorate women's hats. This particular guy, who had been a major promoter of the exposure of this particular hunt, was one of the people who hunted a flock of Carolina parakeets and ended up killing most of the birds in a flock, because these were birds that had such compassion for one another that if you shot one out of a flock, the rest of the flock would by no means leave. They would just hover around and try to land and try to rouse the bird that had been killed. And so it made it possible for people to basically wipe out entire flocks of 200 birds if they wanted to do so, and oftentimes they did. So that collection was really, it unfortunately played some significant role in the demise of several species.
And there are examples throughout your book of empathy among animals and displays of grief, and most of them fell on just unseeing eyes and deaf ears among the people who were hunting them. All the while, the native people here did know that there was a deep kinship between people and animals, as you mentioned before. And then Darwin comes along and says, hey guys, we're animals. And so either we all have souls or nobody has souls. And that was a massive shift. It didn't make a difference for a while. People still killed vast numbers of animals. And I mean, you described there's some hats that had entire birds in them.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, the first glimmers of what became the conservation movement came about. What did that look like? Who were some of the early voices?
Probably one of the really important voices, and he's certainly a flawed character, as I describe in the book, but William Temple Hornaday, who started his career as a taxidermist and ended up working at the Bronx Zoo, and also is the man responsible for helping save buffalo and getting the government to establish these bison refuges to try to preserve buffalo. Not as wild animals, by the way, but as at least preserving them. Hornaday wrote not only the first real major monograph about the extermination of the buffalo, where he does, incidentally, promote the idea that it was the market hunt that killed buffalo and the government's inability and unwillingness to stop the market hunt that produced it. But Hornaday also wrote a book in 1913 called Our Vanishing Wildlife, in which he does two things. One thing he says in that book is that no species of bird, reptile, or mammal can survive being turned into a market commodity and hunted for capitalism. And so he becomes kind of the forefront of bringing to an end the idea of killing wild animals purely as market commodities. But the other thing that Hornaday does in Our Vanishing Wildlife is he's kind of a one-man Endangered Species Act 60 years before we passed the Endangered Species Act. He writes long treatises about all the animals that he believes are threatened and are going to disappear, and makes the point that no civilized country in the world should allow its, the word he uses is patrimony. I mean, he's writing in the early 20th century, but he says no civilized country in the world should allow this to happen. And what he's invoking to me, I actually title a chapter after one of Henry David Thoreau's lines that he had written in the 1850s, where Thoreau, as one of the first people to observe the loss of species that he no longer is going to get to experience. He knows that in 1850s Massachusetts, he's not going to get to see a moose. He's not going to get to see whooping cranes. He's not going to get to see this whole phenomenon of migrations that his forebears had seen, because, as he puts it, some demigod has come before me and plucked out of the heavens the best of the stars. And as Thoreau says, I wish to know an entire heaven and an entire earth. So Hornaday's whole idea is, not only are we robbing the country of its ancient bestiary, but what we're doing is turning all subsequent generations into this poor, as Thoreau put it, these citizens whom I pity, who are not ever going to get to see, as my own grandparents did, passenger pigeons fly through the sky. And as that citizen whom I pity, I have never gotten to witness down the timeline from them.
How did public opinion really start to change over the course of the 20th century?
Well, it began to change primarily as a result of scientific breakthroughs. The Ecological Society of America was founded in 1913. I mean, Americans had no idea what the hell ecology was for a long time, but the ecologists began studying relationships between species, and they were the first to begin to realize that if you extract an animal like the wolf from America, you are going to basically disentangle these rich ancient connections that have been there for maybe 5 million years since wolves first evolved. So the ecologists were a part of it, but I mean, it's kind of interesting. At the same time that the Ecological Society was formed in 1913, the next year, Martha, the last passenger pigeon on Earth, died in the Cincinnati Zoo. I looked around for obituaries for Martha. I could hardly find any. And of course, okay, so it's 1914. The Great War is about to break out. Sure enough, Americans, like everybody else around the world, is sort of focused on the looming war in Europe. But I did find a couple of obituaries of Martha, and one of the ones I found in a New York newspaper said this about Martha. And I think this kind of, in a way, summed up what a lot of Americans of the time thought. We're creating an America based on the European model. Europeans, long ago, wiped out all their charismatic animals. That's probably, in order to create civilization, what we're supposed to do. So this New York paper says about the extinction of the passenger pigeon, well, it's too bad, I guess, but at least we can take to heart the fact that the passenger pigeon hasn't decided to stick around with us the way grasshoppers seem to be doing. And so maybe it's a good thing, and we can one day get rid of grasshoppers too. That seemed to be kind of a prevailing attitude in the early 20th century. Well, we don't have wild buffalo anymore. Why would we want wild buffalo? Why would we want wolves? Why would we want passenger pigeons? Why would we want any of these things if we're trying to create a new country that looks like France or Germany or England? And it takes a while for us to begin to kind of recognize that this is part of the magic of America and has been for a very long time that we've had these animals.
Well, and I think one of the things that you said, which was such an interesting moment in the book, where people began to realize through scientific study, and the first scientific study came out and it was rejected because it didn't fit with what people wanted to hear. But basically, if you take predators out of a landscape, then there's an overabundance of their prey animals, and then those animals starve, and it's actually the predators that keep them in balance. And after a while, it was like, yeah, we just keep doing studies and they keep saying that, so I guess it's true.
Yeah, this is the famous eruption story that Aldo Leopold, who is 20th century's most famous American ecologist, studied. And what Leopold and the other ecologists were witnessing was, as we were wiping out wolves, and we did actually have a government program, the Bureau of Biological Survey, to wipe out wolves and predators, unlike buffalo. I mean, in this case, it was the government's actions following the lead of livestock associations and state governments that had paid bounties on wolves. Now the federal government has an agency that's trying to wipe out all these predators. And their idea basically is, if you kill all the predators, imagine how great it will be for elk and deer, and we'll just substitute human sport hunters for predators. And everything will be wonderful. It'll be the Elysian Fields. Well, what of course began happening was America began suffering wild animal, ungulate, moose, elk, deer eruptions.
Overpopulation.
Overpopulation, where when the predators are gone, suddenly these animals explode in numbers. They eat up all their food and they die by the tens of thousands. Carcasses just litter the landscape. Aldo Leopold studied this and realized, which is what sort of brings him around to being a wolf advocate, he realizes that he can't find any evidence for eruptions except for two incidences before 1900. But between 1900 and 1945, he finds 42 of them. And of course, they correspond to the elimination of predators across the landscape.
It's interesting because we still have going on. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago that New Mexico outlawed coyote killing contests.
That's right.
We still have this kind of like, let's kill them all attitude.
Yeah, and I think, the coyote killing contests are pretty despicable, but they build on a lot of these things that I have talked about here. I think in order to be a participant in a coyote killing contest, first of all, you have to think of a coyote as something completely different than you, which means you have no compassion for it as a fellow mammal, a fellow species that comes out of the evolutionary stream just as you do. And you probably also have the idea that, okay, I'm doing good for the herding culture. I'm doing good for people who herd sheep and cows because for 8,000 years this has been a kind of an old world tradition that you eliminate predators in order to serve the interests of the herding community. And you probably have to also kind of think, well, it's not an animal with a soul. The Bible says, into your hand are they delivered, so I can do with them whatever I wish.
I was reflecting as I was reading your book that there's a kind of, I mean, we Americans, descendants of Europeans, Americans in general, in so many ways are such a generous people and kind people and all of that. But this inhumanity that we have toward animals, we also have it toward each other when one group is considered. I mean, we have the whole history of slavery. We do have the Native American history. We also have the way we demonize certain groups of immigrants or certain groups of people who maybe we're at war with. I was wondering, is this all like sort of the same? Does it come from that same source, that dehumanization or distancing oneself, like I'm not like you?
Yeah, it's the other, I think.
Yeah, otherness thing.
Yeah, it's the other thing, and and we find ourselves, it's altogether too easy for us to do that, and this may be a really ancient instinct, sort of like the hunting instinct. It may be something that goes back to, the original premise of the only members of a group that I'm willing to protect and regard as worthy of my support and defense are those who share my genes. And we've gradually over time drawn that circle larger and larger and larger to include people who aren't necessarily your brothers or sisters or cousins or close relatives, but we still have a kind of an instinct to do that, to turn other groups, other humans, and certainly other species into something separate from us. And so it's that human exceptionalism idea that has a long legacy and it's got a long tail into the present too.
Well, and I guess it's really all about how your culture codes that. I mean, if Native American traditions had a lot of ceremonies that called in our kinship with those animals, those ceremonies were probably necessary to kind of minimize that othering instinct that we have.
Yes, and by doing those kinds of ceremonies, you keep that othering instinct in check, and you you continue to you perpetuate this idea that we're all a part of, in Darwinian terms, all a part of the same earthly evolutionary stream. We lack those kinds of things in the Western world, and as a result of that, it's more difficult for us to see these kind of compassionate connections between ourselves and other animals.
At the same time, here we are. We passed the Endangered Species Act in the 1970s, and you have a long section in the book which talks about what a huge step forward that was, to the point where this country, which had the greatest killing machine of wildlife in the history of the planet, now has one of the strongest laws.
Yes, the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which will have its 50th anniversary next year in 2023, was the Hail Mary that turned this story around. And as I write in the book, it was a thing of a particular moment in American history. It couldn't have happened earlier than it happened, and it very well might not have been able to happen later in time. It was a part, sort of the culminating act, really, of this great age of environmental legislation that included clean water and clean air and national trails and national rivers and the Wilderness Act and on, trying to control car emissions and so forth. But the Endangered Species Act of 1973 was based on a very simple premise. The idea was that other creatures have a basic right to exist. And as Richard Nixon, who was the president who signed that law, said of it, other creatures have a right to exist that was not granted to them by us and is not ours to take away. Fortunately, he didn't go on and identify, say, a deity as having granted that right. So you're free to interpret that, as I do when I read that, as evolution granted that right to other species. But I think he was right on target by saying, and it's not ours to deny them. And so the Endangered Species Act becomes this heroic kind of Hail Mary piece of legislation that begins to not only stop this mindless destruction, almost clueless destruction of other animals, but it also sets in motion the recovery projects that have us today, for example, recovering wolves in the Southwest, in the Northern Rockies, in the Great Lakes, and having California condors back in several populations, in recovering bald eagles and golden eagles and peregrine falcons. I mean, and the list just goes on and on and on.
And they're huge comeback stories. I mean, from
Wonderful, yeah.
very few animals, and I wonder about the genetic diversity and all of that, but that you address that in the book. I don't want to go into it too much right now, but I mean, these are animals that many of them we would have lost.
Yes, we would have lost. I mean, growing up in Louisiana, when I was a senior in high school in 1967, there were two acts that preceded the Grand Act of 1973. And under one of those acts, alligators were proclaimed an endangered species. I had grown up in Louisiana on the banks of a bayou called the Black Bayou. I had never seen an alligator, although I spent a huge amount of time outside and out in the woods. Never saw an alligator, never heard an alligator roar. They were gone from Louisiana by the time I graduated high school. And of course, that's been one of the species that we have recovered in really pretty grand fashion. So the Endangered Species Act, I take a lot of hope from it because it makes me think that Americans are capable of rising to the occasion of saving the world. Now, admittedly, this saved the world at a time when saving the world wasn't political. So there were 494 votes in the two houses of Congress on the Endangered Species Act. Only 12 of those 494 were against it. Yeah. 482 votes in the House and the Senate were for passing the Endangered Species Act.
And one of the things that was very important about that act was that listing of species and recovery of species and all of that was decoupled from economic considerations. So somebody couldn't say, well, we can't do that because I won't make money.
Yes, in fact, the act was deliberately drawn up to evaluate whether a species was threatened or endangered based on the best science available, and economic factors could not be taken into consideration. Now, to be sure, I will say to some of your listeners who will quickly raise the specter of the spotted owl or the snail darter, that one of the things the Endangered Species Act did do, because it was such a powerful piece of legislation, as the Supreme Court of the United States said about it, this is the most important and far-reaching piece of legislation ever passed in the world on behalf of saving endangered species. But because it was that far-reaching, and because it was willing to tell people that you can't kill a bald eagle on your own farm because it's an endangered species, the Endangered Species Act also had the unfortunate result of beginning the kind of bifurcation and opposition between folks who believe that the economy is the most important thing in the world and environmentalists and conservationists on the other hand, so that it became one of those markers of the partisanship that characterizes our own time. And you began to see it by the time Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980.
And we're seeing pushback up to the present day.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'll just give you one example. Barack Obama put 340 new species of plants and animals on the endangered and threatened species list. A Democratic administration, the Republican administration of Donald Trump, put 20 species on the endangered species list, and Trump also moved to basically remove protection from animals like gray wolves, particularly in the northern Rockies and the Midwest.
So we now have this world that we live in where, I think when I look just at my own life, when I was a kid, we had a dog. We paid no attention to the emotional needs of that dog, or really, we didn't treat that dog as a valued member of the family. It was just sort of this friendly thing that came along with us. And when I feel guilty to this day of how we just didn't tend to that dog and walk it enough and pay attention to it enough. It was just our little pet. And that's changed. That has changed universally. People are much more cognizant of the needs of non-human animals, both their own pets and wildlife. So there have been all kinds of changes. We also live in a world where there is so much extractive industry, and this goes for agriculture and all kinds of industries around us. We have seriously fragmented habitat, and like it or not, we do have wolves that are reintroduced, and I think that's a good thing, but they are killing livestock, and we have to deal with that. Wolves can be a threat, and predators can be a threat for people who are trying to make a living. So this is a big, huge question, but how do you see, and what do you think it would take at this point for humanity and for this country to live side by side with wildlife where we can both thrive, knowing that we don't really have these sort of giant tracts of connected land where there's no people, or where people are living in a way that, don't interfere with this wildlife?
I do think, and I so argue in Wild New World, that Americans hung on for too long to the notion that our goal was to create the United States as a clone of European countries. And the reason I think we hung on to it for too long is because one of the things the Roosevelt conservationists did put into place more than 100 years ago was a system of public lands and wild lands such as no European country can even come close to matching. So we do have, stretching from where we're sitting 20 miles away, the southern Rocky Mountains all the way into Alaska, up to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a place I visited for the sake of the book. These huge wildlands where it's possible for us to retain wolves and grizzly bears, and ultimately, I hope, a reintroduction of jaguars and some of these animals that were part of our legacy in North America, our ancient legacy in North America, that make us distinctive from anywhere else in the world. It's true that not everywhere has places like that. Texas, for example, has almost no public lands. Many of the states east of the Mississippi don't have a great deal of public lands, but even states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, farther north into New England, into the White Mountains, for example. I mean, there are stretches of country where it's possible to still have big animals, such as the ones that were here when Europeans arrived 500 years ago. And I think that makes us different. As you suggest, we are having to work on connectivity. I mean, we're having to come up with plans to make it possible for populations of animals to find other populations of animals. When I was living in Montana, one of the critical ones was, how do you link up the population of grizzly bears in Glacier National Park with the population of bears that's in Yellowstone? And what we were trying to do at the time was to get a population of bears in the Bitterroot Mountains in between, so that there would be the possibility of another population that would provide connectivity. So that's one of the things we're working on in the 21st century. I think we are just now, to me, wrapping our heads around how to do this. And I mean, I talk, for example, about American Prairie's attempt to sort of correct history's error in America by not preserving a park or a landscape big enough to harbor herds of wild buffalo, wolves, grizzlies, all the great bestiary, like the African game parks that we could have gotten in America, and we didn't do 100 years ago.
Some Indian tribes now are reintroducing buffalo as wild animals. It's so interesting.
Absolutely, they are. I mean, I talk in the book about a conversation I had with one of the founders of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, who told me this sort of wonderful story that I've kind of never really gotten over, about when he and others were first considering founding this organization to return buffalo to the Indian reservations. An elderly Lakota woman said, before you guys do that, you probably should do a ceremony and ask the buffalo if they want to come back. And he sort of held off telling me what the result of that was. For a couple of bites of his meal, we were having dinner together, and finally I managed to cajole him. Well, tell me, what did you do it? And if you did, what did the buffalo say? He finally said, yes, we did hold a ceremony. And the buffalo said, yes, they did want to come back, but they didn't want to come back and be cows. They wanted to come back and be buffalo. They wanted to be wild again.
Dan Flores, you make a case for spending less time sort of grieving and mourning what's been lost. And reading your book, I have to say, it was tough at times, although it is an optimistic book when it all comes down to it, but really spending more time getting to know and appreciate what we still have. And that's sort of how you're choosing to live your life.
Yes, and that's how I ended the book. I concluded, as I was working on it and thinking about this daily, almost hourly, for several years, trying to put Wild New World together, that what really came down to the final lesson of a book like this is that we may not be able to ever experience an entire heaven and an entire earth. We're all in Thoreau's boat. We have had previous generations of human beings diminish the world in ways that we're not going to be able to recover from. But I decided as I approached the end of the book that I wasn't going to let that be the ultimate lesson or the ultimate drag on my own life. And so what I wrote about in those last couple of pages was, in fact, experiencing what is here and what is still left to us rather than mourning what has been lost. And so I try to describe some of my own experiences in doing that. And you're exactly right. That's how I've tried to live my life.
Dan Flores is author of the book Wild New World, The Epic Story of Animals and People in America. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Mary Charlotte.
This is a long show. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. And I want to wish you a very happy holiday season. This is our last show until the new year. We'll be starting again, I think, in the second week of January. Happy winter solstice, happy winter holidays to you and your families. And I also want to personally thank the Quivira Coalition for having this podcast and for the tremendous work they do here on this earth. Just incredible people doing great things. So thank you. You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.